Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. Today Beijing published a lot of new economic data. We will unpack this in tomorrow's video. And one small update before we move into the main stories. Over the weekend, China and Australia's top trade officials agreed to resume high-level economic dialogue channels in a sign of steadily improving relations between the two Pacific players after years of estrangement. On Friday, trade ministers from the two countries met in person for the first time since 2019. Both sides committed to greater trade engagement and to, quote, step up dialogue, end quote. In May of 2021, China suspended all activities under the China-Australia Strategic Economic Dialogue in retaliation against the then Australian Prime Minister's decision to cancel agreements between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Victoria State Government. Relations had already been in decline before that. In 2020, in response to Canberra calling for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, Beijing imposed restrictions on several key Australian imports. Australia primarily exports metals and agricultural products to China, as well as coal. In 2022, trade between China and Australia declined by 3.9% year-on-year. Despite this, however, China remains one of the most important trade partners for Australian exporters. Okay, now for the main developments. This week, we'll see two geopolitically important summits. This Thursday and Friday, the China Central Asia Summit will be held in the ancient Chinese city of Xi'an in central China's Shanxi province of terracotta warrior fame. General Secretary Xi Jinping and leaders of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan will attend. Most of the leaders are also paying state visits to Beijing this week, starting today, Tuesday, and ending on Saturday. More than one commentator has asked how Moscow will view such a meeting. Despite their public closeness, both Xi and Putin understand that Central Asia, which until quite recently in historical terms was Russia's backyard, has traditionally been a region of geopolitical Sino-Russo competition. But for now, especially with the Ukraine war raging, relations remain very close. We learned yesterday that Russia's Prime Minister is to head a high-profile delegation to a business forum, the Russia-China Business Forum, in Shanghai next week. Russia's top energy official, Alexander Novak, will also attend. UK-based Financial Times, which broke the story, writes that the event is expected to underscore China's growing support for Vladimir Putin after Western nations passed sweeping sanctions in response to the invasion that cut Russia off from global markets and critical supply chains. A draft program for the forum, seen by the outlet, quote, outlines Russian and Chinese plans to increase economic cooperation in areas from agriculture to transport to energy, industry and tech, end quote. Russia's bilateral trade with China hit almost $200 billion in 2022, a new record in bilateral trade, and grew 39% year-on-year to $54 billion in the first quarter of this year. Quote, the RMB has also taken on an increasing role in Russia's payments after Western sanctions left it largely unable to use the dollar. End quote. Returning to the China Central Asian Summit, state-run Global Times writes on the summit this week, quote, cooperation on security will have another focus at the summit because of new risks and challenges in the region, including the risks emanating from the US's hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan that has spoiled over to regional countries and the ongoing Ukraine crisis. End quote. State-run The People's Daily writes that China's direct investment in the region has reached $15 billion, with projects, quote, launched in fields such as oil and gas exploration, processing and manufacturing, connectivity and digital technologies, bringing tangible benefits to people in these countries. End quote. Geopolitical influence in the region is important for China. However, energy security has also been a primary objective for Beijing in its relations with the region in recent years. The other important summit, of course, is the G7, to be held in Hiroshima, Japan, later this week. China will likely be top of the agenda, along with Ukraine and global financial stability. However, some reports suggest that some nations are hesitant to call out China by name. A joint statement rejecting the use of economic retaliation against nations over policy disputes and other disagreements is planned for the meeting. However, US-based financial media outlet The Wall Street Journal writes yesterday, quote, "The anticipated statement isn't expected to mention any country by name, but comes as concerns mount among the US and its allies over Beijing's increasing use of what its critics call economic coercion to show its displeasure with other countries." End quote. UK-based Reuters reports that at a pre-G7 meeting of finance ministers, which just concluded, the finance chiefs could not agree to mention a US proposed idea for narrow restrictions on investment to China, quote, "a potential rift among the grouping on how far they should go in pressuring Beijing." End quote. State media has jumped on these reports, framing it as a big political win for China. Quote, "Western media outlets are already hyping the so-called China's economic coercion narrative in the joint statement to be issued. Given the US's declining global strength and rising uncertainty over its financial and economic systems, as well as the increasingly pragmatic and mutually beneficial China-EU cooperation, reaching agreement on that will be difficult. The G7 could be more divided than united in the future." End quote. As several commentators have pointed out, if some G7 members are uncomfortable with calling out China by name in relation to accusations of economic coercion, Beijing certainly has no problem with it. Quote, "No one is more qualified than the US to be called out for economic coercion. Japan surely knows this best from its experience with the Plaza Accord of the 1980s. If G7 members truly care about economic security, they should ask the US not to try to avoid default by continuing to raise the debt ceiling. If G7 members truly care about economic security, they should immediately find out who's responsible for the Nord Stream pipeline blast. We urge the US, Japan, and other G7 countries, all members of the Club of the Rich, not to harm the interests of the many for the selfish interests of the few in the world of nations." End quote. We will follow the G7 meeting as it relates to China later this week. Next up, growing concerns surrounding what appears to be a crackdown on foreign companies in China. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Last week, the US Chamber of Commerce hosted a conference in Washington, D.C., discussing how businesses should look at the risk they now face in the PRC. At the event, Susan Clark, the Chamber's chief executive, said the new counter-espionage law and crackdown on consulting firms, which we have been following here on China Update, quote, "have ratcheted up risk and uncertainty in the market." End quote. China analyst Bill Bishop, who we have quoted on occasion here, attended the event, and today he posted on his observations. Quote, "The conference was off the record, so I will just say that the recent raids and the mixed messages they send have caused a lot of concern, and as that concern flows up into boardrooms, it is going to be even harder for many firms to approve additional investments into the PRC. So, while these raids may not accelerate decoupling, they will likely accelerate the trend of new investments going into places other than the PRC." End quote. Over the weekend, UK-based Financial Times reports that Boston-based consulting firm Forrester Research plans to fire several dozen employees in China, quote, "as company executives react to an intensifying crackdown on Western research and due diligence companies." End quote. The company said that the move to close its China office is just part of previously announced global restructuring, quote, "that was driven by economic issues." End quote. However, the Financial Times, citing two unnamed sources, writes that the decision to cut the jobs in China was in response to, quote, "the recent tightening of restrictions on Western consultancies, scrutinizing China's investments and business partners for foreign clients." End quote. Some analysts warn too that things will likely get worse. Quote, "President Xi has made it pretty clear that security trumps development. If that requires cracking some skulls at the consulting firms and scaring off foreign capital in the process, then that's a price that he appears willing to pay." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful Tuesday wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.